In the rolling farmland of Central Europe, a farmer once knelt beside a shallow trench, brushing soil from something that did not belong to the modern world. It was a ring of blackened earth, no wider than a dinner plate, ringed with small fragments of burned clay. A hearth. Beneath it, more shapes began to emerge, post holes arranged in a rectangle, the faint outline of a wall that had stood roughly 6,000 years before the tractor now resting nearby. Archaeologists would spend the following months carefully exposing what remained of the structure. A longhouse, one of many such buildings scattered across the farmlands of Neolithic Europe. The excavation revealed charred grain, fragments of pottery, worn stone tools, and the small bones of domesticated animals. None of it spoke in words. All of it, together, described a life. This documentary imagines that life, built from the patient work of archaeologists, botanists, and anthropologists who have spent generations reconstructing the world of early farmers. It is not a record of one specific family whose names we know. Such a record does not exist. It is instead a plausible reconstruction, a single day imagined with care, grounded in the physical evidence left behind by people who lived at the edge of the forest, tending fields their grandparents had cleared by hand. The period we now call the Neolithic marks one of the most significant shifts in human history, the gradual movement from hunting and foraging towards farming and settled village life. This transition did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not happen quickly. Across many centuries, communities in different regions began keeping herds, planting selected seeds, and building homes meant to last more than a single season. By the time of the family we will follow this evening, farming had already been practiced in this part of Europe for many generations. The forest around their settlement had been cleared field by field, tree by tree, by people whose names have long since disappeared from memory, but whose labor remains visible in the soil itself. We do not know exactly what they called themselves or what language filled their homes. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggest this region's farming communities descended partly from earlier hunter-gatherer populations and partly from migrating farming groups who had arrived from the southeast over previous centuries, bringing wheat, barley, and domesticated animals. The blending of these populations and their ways of life shaped the world our imagined family inhabits. Picture, then, a low ridge above a slow-moving river, somewhere in what is now Central Europe. It is late spring. The forest has been pushed back from the valley floor, replaced by irregular fields of einkorn wheat and barley, their green shoots still low enough to see the dark soil beneath them. A scatter of longhouses stands along the ridge, their timber frames weathered gray, their thatched or turfed roofs catching the last blue light before dawn. Smoke rises faintly from one or two of them, where someone has already stirred the coals of last night's fire. This is not a scene of hardship alone, nor one of romantic simplicity. It is a working world, full of skill or judgment passed down through careful observation of soil, of weather, of the particular temperament of a family's goats. The people who lived here understood their landscape with an intimacy that modern visitors rarely experience. They knew which slope drained too quickly after rain, which stand of hazel produced the straightest poles, which season brought the salmon upriver. Tonight, we follow a single household through a single day, waking before sunrise and closing the evening with the last embers of the hearth. Along the way, we will pause to consider the wider world these people inhabited, their homes, their fields, their tools, their trade routes, and their beliefs.
insofar as the evidence allows us to describe them responsibly. Some of what follows rests on strong physical evidence. Some of it is reconstruction, built from comparison with other early farming societies and from the patient science of archaeology. Where the evidence grows thin, the narration will say so plainly. For now, the ridge above the river is still quiet. The stars have not yet faded. Somewhere below the eastern hills, the first pale edge of morning is beginning to rise, and inside one particular longhouse, a woman is about to wake. It is worth pausing before we step inside to consider what this reconstruction is attempting to do and what it is not. It is not a documentary about a single named archaeological site, nor an attempt to describe one specific excavation in precise detail. Instead, it draws broadly from the accumulated findings of many excavations across Central Europe, blending well-supported patterns into a single coherent household. This approach, common among archaeologists and historians who write for general audiences, allows the wider patterns of evidence to speak through the intimacy of one imagined family, rather than remaining scattered across dozens of technical reports. The choice to focus on a single day is also deliberate. Much of what survives from this period comes to us in fragments: a broken pot here, a scatter of charred grain there, a scraped hide, a worn quernstone. Archaeologists spend careers reassembling these fragments into a picture of ordinary time, the kind of day that left almost no trace precisely because it was repeated, with only minor variation, thousands and thousands of times. It is this ordinariness, more than any single dramatic event, that tonight's documentary hopes to honor.
Before we step inside that longhouse, it helps to understand the landscape surrounding it, because in a farming community, geography was destiny in the most literal sense. The valley our family called home was shaped by a river that flooded gently each spring, depositing a thin layer of fertile silt across the lower fields. Farmers of this period had not yet developed the technology to plow deeply or irrigate on a large scale, so they relied heavily on land that renewed itself naturally, choosing fields close to water and periodically letting exhausted plots rest. The climate here was temperate, with warm summers and cool, damp winters. Rainfall was generally reliable, though certainly not guaranteed, and a poor harvest could mean real hardship the following winter. Archaeobotanical evidence, the study of ancient plant remains recovered from soil samples and storage pits, shows that communities like this one grew einkorn and emmer wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, supplemented by flax, which provided both oil and fiber for cloth. Forest still dominated much of the surrounding land. Clearing it required enormous, sustained labor. Stone axes, though far less efficient than later metal tools, were capable of felling trees when used patiently and in groups. And archaeological evidence of ring barking, cutting a strip of bark around a tree to slowly kill a tree, suggests farmers sometimes used a combination of techniques to open new land without felling every tree by hand. Clearings expanded gradually across generations, each family adding modestly to what earlier households had begun. Animals lived closely alongside people in this world. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs had all been domesticated by this period, arriving in this part of Europe through a mixture of migration and cultural exchange with farming communities from further southeast. Domesticated cattle, in particular, required significant grazing land and were valued not only for meat, but for milk, hides, and labor.
Some archaeological sites from later in the Neolithic show evidence of wear on cattle bones consistent with pulling loads, suggesting that the practice of using animals to haul weight was beginning to develop, though this evidence becomes clearer in later centuries than in the one we are visiting tonight. Settlements themselves were often modest in size, a handful of longhouses, sometimes a few dozen, arranged for practical rather than ceremonial logic, close to water, farmland, and timber. Some communities relocated after a generation or two as soil fertility declined or as families expanded and needed new land. Others remained in the same location for centuries, rebuilding their homes on the same footprints their ancestors had used, a pattern archaeologists can trace by finding layered post holes stacked directly on top of one another. Trade connected these seemingly isolated communities to a much wider world than we might expect. Flint, valued for its sharp, predictable fracture, sometimes traveled significant distances from specific quarry sites to farming villages that had no local source of stone suitable for tools. Certain shell ornaments, originating near coastlines, have been found hundreds of kilometers inland, evidence of exchange networks stretching across much of the continent. We will return to this subject later, but it is worth noting now, the world of a single farming family, however local their daily concerns, was not cut off from distant places.
Socially, evidence from cemeteries and settlement patterns suggests these communities were generally organized around households and extended kin groups rather than centralized political authority. This does not mean life lacked structure. Elders likely held influence through experience and knowledge. Cooperative labor, building a house, clearing a field, harvesting grain before weather turned, required coordination among multiple families, and archaeologists have long debated exactly how such cooperation was organized, whether through kinship obligation, seasonal gathering, or some early form of communal decision-making. The honest answer is that we do not fully know. What we can say with more confidence is that survival here depended on cooperation as much as on individual skill. It is into this landscape, cleared fields, patient rivers, forested hills, and long-distance trade routes threading quietly through the trees that our story now returns, as the sky above the ridge begins, at last, to lighten toward morning. The seasonal rhythm of this landscape shaped nearly every decision a household made. Spring brought planting and the anxious watching of new shoots for signs of frost damage. Summer demanded constant weeding and the careful management of livestock as pasture began to thin under sustained grazing. Autumn brought harvest, the most labor-intensive and most consequential period of the entire year, when weeks of careful work determined whether a household would eat comfortably through the coming winter or face genuine scarcity. Winter itself, though quieter in terms of field work, brought its own demands, maintaining shelter, managing stored food carefully, and keeping animals alive through the coldest months, when fodder set aside during the warmer seasons became essential to a herd's survival. Archaeologists studying pollen records preserved in ancient lake and bog sediments, a method known as pollenology, have been able to reconstruct with reasonable confidence how forest cover changed across centuries in regions like this one, tracking the slow generational expansion of cleared farmland into what had once been continuous woodland. These records show that the landscape our family inhabited was not static. It had been actively, gradually reshaped by human hands over a period stretching back many generations before their own birth,
and it would continue changing long after they were gone, as forest gave way bit by bit to the enduring patchwork of fields that still characterizes much of this region today. The domesticated crops and animals that made this life possible had themselves traveled a long and gradual journey before ever reaching this particular valley. Genetic research on modern wheat and barley varieties, compared against ancient plant remains recovered from early farming sites, has allowed researchers to trace the origins of these staple crops back to wild ancestor plants first cultivated many centuries earlier, far to the southeast, in the region often referred to as the Fertile Crescent. From there, farming knowledge and, crucially, the seeds and breeding animals themselves spread gradually across Europe over a period of well over 1,000 years, carried forward not by any single migration, but by countless overlapping waves of movement, exchange, and adaptation, as farming communities pushed steadily into new territory, generation after generation. This long history means that the einkorn wheat swaying gently in Bren's fields that morning represented the end point of an enormous, largely invisible inheritance. Thousands of years of careful, cumulative selection by farmers whose names and faces are entirely lost to us, choosing which seeds to replant based on which plants had grown best, resisted disease most successfully, or produced the most reliable harvest. Bren himself likely had no explicit awareness of this deep history. He simply worked with the crop his parents and grandparents had worked with before him, inheriting, without fully realizing it, the accumulated wisdom of an agricultural tradition stretching back far beyond living memory.
Ylva woke the way she always did, without any sound to prompt her, simply because her body had learned the rhythm of the season. The air inside the longhouse was cool and faintly smoky, carrying the smell of last night's fire and the drier scent of stored grain from the far end of the building. She lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere near the roof beam, a bird shifted in its nest. Beside her, Bren breathed slowly, still asleep. She rose carefully, stepping over the low partition that separated the sleeping area from the rest of the house, and made her way toward the hearth at the building's center. The coals from the previous night still held a faint red glow beneath a layer of gray ash. She knelt, added a handful of dry moss and thin kindling, and leaned close, breathing gently until a small flame caught and steadied. Fire-keeping was one of the quiet, constant responsibilities of daily life. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic hearths shows that many households worked to preserve embers overnight rather than relighting a fire from nothing each morning, a practice that required regular tending but saved considerable effort compared to friction-based fire starting, which, while certainly known and used when necessary, demanded more time and skill. Ylva had learned this skill from her own mother, who had learned it in turn from the woman before her, an unbroken thread of small, practical knowledge passed hand to hand. With the fire settled, she stepped toward the doorway and pushed aside the woven mat that covered it. Outside, the sky had shifted from black to a deep blue-gray, and a thin mist lay low across the fields below the ridge. The air smelled of damp earth and green wheat. Somewhere down near the river, a bird called twice and went quiet. She stood there for a moment, simply looking. The longhouses of the settlement were visible as dark shapes against the paling sky,
smoke beginning to rise from one or two others as neighbors woke to do the same work she had just finished. Beyond them, the fields stretched in irregular strips toward the tree line, and beyond that, forest rose along the hills, dark and still largely unbroken. This quiet hour before the household woke was for many people in early farming communities one of the only times of true solitude in an otherwise communal life. Ethnographic comparisons with more recent small-scale farming societies, used carefully and only to suggest plausible patterns rather than to claim direct equivalence, suggest that early risers, often women managing the hearth, experienced this pre-dawn period as a brief pause before the demands of the day began. Whether Ylva felt it as peace, habit, or simple necessity, we cannot know. We can only observe that the fire needed tending, and that she was the one who tended it.
Behind her, sounds began to stir. A soft cough, the creak of dried grass bedding as someone shifted position. Sella, Bren's mother, was the next to rise, moving more slowly than Ylva, favoring one hip as she crossed toward the fire to warm her hands. The two women exchanged no words yet. There was rarely need, this early, for anything beyond a nod. Sella settled near the hearth and began arranging the previous day's baking stones closer to the flame, preparing them for the morning's bread. Her hands, weathered and sure, moved with the ease of decades of repetition. She had likely performed this same task on thousands of mornings, in this house and, before it, in the house where she had been born. Outside, the mist over the fields had begun to thin as the sky lightened further. Somewhere, near the animal pen at the edge of the settlement, a goat bleated, restless for its morning feeding. The day, quietly and without ceremony, had begun. Along the packed earth path outside, Ylva could hear the settlement slowly stirring further along the ridge, the low murmur of another household's voices, the scrape of a doormat being pulled aside, a dog, kept by a neighboring family more for warning than companionship, giving a single low bark before falling silent again. These small, familiar sounds carried a kind of reassurance of their own, the quiet evidence that the wider community was waking alongside her own household, each family beginning the same essential tasks in their own version of this same modest rhythm. She glanced once toward the eastern hills, where the sky had begun to take on the faintest suggestion of gold beneath the retreating blue-gray of night, then turned back toward the warmth of the hearth. There was little time for lingering. Bread needed baking, the herd needed checking, and the fields, as they did every day this time of year, needed tending before the sun grew too strong. Ylva ducked back through the doorway, letting the woven mat close behind her, and returned to the fire. By the time the sun's first light touched the ridge, the rest of the household had awoken. It is worth pausing here to properly introduce the family whose day we are following, since Neolithic households, unlike many modern ones, typically included multiple generations and often multiple related family units living and working under one roof. Bren, Ylva's husband, was the household's primary farmer, responsible for the fields, the plow work, insofar as this early period involved simple ard plows or hand tools rather than true plowing, and much of the heavier physical labor involved in clearing land and managing livestock.
He was in his early 30s, an age that in this period placed him solidly in the productive prime of adult life, though skeletal evidence from Neolithic burials across Europe shows that physical labor of this intensity often left visible wear on the joints and spine well before what we would now consider old age. Sella, his mother, was perhaps in her mid-50s, an age reached by a meaningful minority of the population in this period, though life expectancy overall was considerably shorter than in later eras, weighted heavily by high rates of infant and childhood mortality. Those who survived early childhood and avoided serious injury or infection could and did live into old age, and elders like Sella often held important roles as keepers of practical knowledge: which plants were edible, which were dangerous, how to read the signs of an early frost. Ilva, in her late 20s, managed much of the household's food processing, textile work, and childcare, though the strict division of labor by gender in Neolithic farming communities remains a subject of ongoing archaeological debate. Wear patterns on skeletal remains, particularly in the arms and hands, have been used by some researchers to argue that grain processing, a physically demanding task involving repetitive kneeling and grinding, was frequently, though perhaps not exclusively, performed by women in this period. We should hold this conclusion with appropriate caution, as such interpretations continue to be examined and refined. The couple's children were Cade, about 14, old enough to work alongside his father in moose tasks and to be trusted with tools requiring real skill and care, and Nia, 7, still primarily learning, though children of this age were expected to contribute meaningfully to household labor rather than being kept apart from it. The youngest, Pell, was not yet 3 and spent much of each day near Ilva or Sella, watched over even while the two women worked. Living nearby, though not under the same roof, was Oren, a man in his 40s who was regarded, informally, as the community's most skilled toolmaker, and Gath, an elder in his 60s whose memory of past harvests, past floods, and past hardships made him a frequent, if unofficial, source of guidance when decisions needed to be made that affected more than one household. The gap in age between Bren's household and figures like Gath reflects a genuine demographic reality of Neolithic communities. While most people did not survive to what we would now consider advanced old age, a meaningful number did, and these individuals often carried disproportionate social value precisely because of the rarity and depth of their accumulated experience. A person who had personally witnessed several severe droughts, an unusually harsh winter, or the gradual failure and eventual abandonment of a poorly sited field, carried practical knowledge that younger community members simply had not yet had the opportunity to acquire firsthand. This likely explains, at least in part, why figures like Gath, even without any formal political authority, often held real influence within decisions affecting the wider settlement. None of these individuals, again, are drawn from a specific historical record. No names survive from this era in this region. They are constructed from patterns visible across many archaeological sites. Household composition inferred from building size and burial groupings, age distributions from cemetery data, and skill specialization inferred from tool assemblages and workshop debris. Together, they allow us to imagine, responsibly, what a single day within one such household might have looked like. As the family gathered near the hearth that morning, the practical business of the day was already beginning to take shape. Bren checked the sky through the doorway, gauging the weather. Cade pulled on a worn leather wrap for his feet. Naya knelt beside her grandmother, watching the breadstones heat, waiting to be given a task. It was in its rhythms an ordinary morning, which is in many ways the entire point of this reconstruction. Extraordinary events leave the clearest traces in the archaeological record. Ordinary mornings like this one leave almost none at all. And yet, they made up the overwhelming majority of human experience in this period. Households of this size and composition, spanning 3 living generations under one roof, appear to have been common, though not universal, across Neolithic farming communities in this region. Excavated longhouse dimensions vary considerably from site to site, and archaeologists studying settlement patterns have proposed several possible explanations for this variation. Differences in household wealth, differences in family size across a structure's working life, or simply differing local building traditions passed down independently within neighboring communities. Some longer structures may even have housed more than one related family unit under a single extended roof, sharing labor and resources across a slightly wider kin group than the single nuclear household imagined here. What seems reasonably well supported, regardless of exact household composition, is that Neolithic farming life depended fundamentally on cooperation across generations. An elder's accumulated knowledge of weather patterns and plant lore, a father's physical strength for clearing and plowing, a mother's skill in processing food and textiles, and a child's steadily growing capacity for useful labor, together formed a kind of integrated economic unit in which each member's contribution, however different in kind, remained genuinely necessary to the household's overall survival and success. The longhouse itself deserves close attention because it represents one of the most significant technological and social achievements of the early Neolithic period in this region. Unlike the temporary shelters used by hunter-gatherer groups earlier, these structures were built with the clear intention of permanence, often standing for 1 or 2 generations before being rebuilt. Bren's family's house was roughly 20 meters long and 6 meters wide, a scale consistent with excavated longhouse foundations found across many parts of Neolithic Europe. Its frame consisted of heavy timber posts, likely oak, sunk deep into the ground in parallel rows running the length of the building. Archaeologists identify these structures today primarily through the post holes that remain in the soil long after the wood itself has decayed, dark, circular stains that map out a building's skeleton with remarkable precision even thousands of years later. Walls were constructed using a wattle and dog technique, a woven lattice of thin branches, usually hazel or willow, packed and coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, which hardened into a surprisingly durable and weatherproof surface. The roof, steeply pitched to shed rain, was likely thatched with reeds or straw, supported by a ridge beam running the length of the structure. Excavated daub fragments sometimes preserve the impressions of the wattle beneath them, giving archaeologists direct physical evidence of construction techniques used by people who left no written instructions behind. Inside, the house was loosely divided by function rather than by walls in the modern sense. The area nearest the entrance, most exposed to weather and traffic, was often used for animal shelter or storage. Moving further inside, the space opened up into the household's main living area, centered on the hearth Ylva had tended before dawn. Beyond this lay quieter sleeping areas, and at the far end, raised storage platforms kept grain safe from dampness and, as much as possible, from mice. Light in such a house was limited, filtering in through the doorway and, in some reconstructions, through small gaps beneath the eaves, since windows, in the modern sense, did not yet exist. Much of daily indoor life, therefore, happened close to the hearth, whose fire provided not only warmth for cooking, but the primary source of interior light after dark. Building such a house required substantial labor and, importantly, cooperation beyond a single family. Raising the heavy roof timbers, felling and shaping the posts, and gathering enough daub and thatch for a structure of this size would have taken more hands than one household alone could easily provide. This suggests, as many archaeologists have argued, that building such a house was likely a community event, drawing on obligations of kinship or neighborly reciprocity that bound settlements together in practical, everyday ways, even in the absence of formal political structures.
Maintenance was ongoing. Daub cracked and needed patching. Thatch grew thin in places and required replacement. The floor, simply packed earth, wore into shallow depressions along frequently used paths. Depressions archaeologists sometimes find still faintly preserved beneath centuries of later soil accumulation. Over a house's working life, these small repairs accumulated into an intimate, almost bodily familiarity between a family and their home. Each worn threshold and smoke-blackened rafter a quiet record of years lived within those walls. When a house finally reached the end of its usable life, whether through structural decay, changing family needs, or the gradual exhaustion of nearby farmland, it was often deliberately dismantled or burned, and a new house built nearby, sometimes directly atop the old foundation. This practice, observed at numerous sites, has led some archaeologists to interpret house building and rebuilding as more than a purely practical matter, possibly carrying social or symbolic weight tied to family continuity, though this interpretation remains one among several proposed explanations, and the evidence does not allow for full certainty. For Bren's family, none of this history was abstract. It was simply home, a solid, familiar structure that had sheltered 3 generations, its walls holding the accumulated smoke and warmth of countless ordinary mornings, much like this one. The orientation of longhouses across many Neolithic settlements shows a notable, if not universal, tendency towards similar compass alignments within a given region, a pattern archaeologists have puzzled over for decades. Some propose a practical explanation rooted in prevailing wind direction, positioning the entrance to minimize exposure to the harshest seasonal weather. Others have suggested the alignment may reflect the movement of the sun across the sky at particular times of year, hinting at a possible symbolic significance layered atop the purely practical concerns of shelter. Both explanations remain reasonable, and it is entirely possible that a single design choice served multiple purposes simultaneously, blending practical necessity with a less easily measured sense of order and meaning. Inside Bren's household, the smoke from the hearth found its way upward through gaps in the thatch, rather than through any dedicated chimney, gradually blackening the underside of the roof timbers over years of continuous use. This soot layer, while it might seem a minor inconvenience, likely offered a genuine practical benefit, helping to preserve the thatch by discouraging insects and slowing decay. A small example of the accumulated, semi-intentional wisdom embedded in even the most ordinary features of Neolithic domestic architecture. Modern archaeologists reconstructing buildings of this type often rely on a combination of excavated post holes, comparative ethnographic evidence from more recent timber building traditions, and increasingly full-scale experimental reconstructions in which researchers build a working longhouse using only period-appropriate tools and materials. These experimental structures have proven valuable not only for testing construction theories, but for understanding practical questions difficult to answer from excavation alone. How long such a building might reasonably be expected to last before requiring major repair, how much timber and thatch a construction project of this scale actually required, and how a completed structure performed under real seasonal weather, including heavy rain, wind, and snow load. Several such experimental reconstructions across Europe have demonstrated that well-built wattle and daub longhouses can remain structurally sound and genuinely comfortable for several decades with regular maintenance, lending further support to the idea that a house like Bren's family occupied likely represented a multi-generational investment, built with the reasonable expectation that it would shelter not only the current household, but their children and quite possibly their children, long after their original builders had passed. With the breadstones heated and the fire steady, the morning's food preparation began in earnest. Sella knelt beside a large flat stone slab set into the floor near the hearth, a saddle quern, one of the most common and physically demanding tools of Neolithic domestic life. She took a handful of dried einkorn wheat from a woven basket, spread it across the quern's surface, and began working a smaller handstone back and forth across the grain in a steady, practiced rhythm. Grinding grain by hand was slow, repetitive work. Producing enough flour for a single day's bread for a household of this size could take a significant portion of the morning, and the physical toll of this labor, performed daily across a lifetime, is visible in the archaeological record itself. Studies of Neolithic skeletal remains have identified distinctive patterns of bone density and joint wear in the arms, shoulders, and knees of individuals, predominantly, though not exclusively, women, consistent with the repeated kneeling and grinding motion this task required. It is a sobering reminder that the food we now associate with comfort and simplicity, bread, represented genuinely strenuous daily labor for the people who first relied on it. Ilva joined her mother-in-law, and the two women fell into an easy division of the task, one grinding while the other sifted the resulting flour through a woven mesh to remove coarser fragments, which would be reground. Nia, nearby, was given the job of picking small stones and chaff from a bowl of unground grain, a task simple enough for a child her age, but genuinely useful, freeing the adults from having to do it themselves. Once enough flour had accumulated, it was mixed with water into a thick, coarse dough. This period predates the widespread use of yeast-leavened bread in most of Europe, so the result was likely a dense, flat loaf, closer to a hearth cake than to modern bread. The dough was shaped by hand and placed directly onto the heated stones near the fire, where it cooked slowly, turned occasionally to avoid burning on one side. While the food came together, the household gathered loosely near the hearth to eat, not with any formal ceremony, but with the practical rhythm of people who needed fuel before a long day of physical labor. Bren ate quickly, already thinking ahead to the fields. Cade ate more slowly, occasionally slipping a small piece of bread to Pell, who sat contentedly in Ilva's lap.
Meals in this period served purposes beyond simple nutrition. They were also, necessarily, moments of brief pause within an otherwise demanding day, an opportunity, however short, for the household to be together in one place before scattering to their separate tasks. Whether this held emotional significance for the family in the way it might for us today is not something archaeology can directly answer. What the physical evidence tells us clearly is that food preparation consumed a substantial portion of daily labor, particularly for the women of the household, and that grain, painstakingly grown, harvested, stored, and ground, sat at the very center of Neolithic survival. With the meal finished and the fire banked low again, the household began to separate for the day's work. Bren rose first, glancing once more toward the sky, and called for Cade to bring the tools they would need in the fields. Grain storage represented another quietly essential aspect of household survival, one requiring almost as much care as growing the grain in the first place. Excavated storage pits at numerous Neolithic sites, lined with clay or basketry to help keep moisture at bay, show that early farmers had developed genuine practical solutions to one of agriculture's most persistent challenges: keeping a full year's harvest edible and free from rot or pest damage until the next season's crop was ready. Some households also used raised platforms within the longhouse itself, like the one described earlier, allowing air to circulate beneath stored grain baskets and further reducing the risk of dampness and spoilage. The margin between sufficiency and hardship in this system was often narrow. A poorly sealed storage pit, an unusually damp autumn, or an infestation of grain-eating pests could mean the loss of food that had taken an entire growing season and considerable communal effort to produce. It is little wonder, then, that so much daily attention across the Neolithic household was devoted not only to producing food, but to the quieter, less celebrated work of preserving it successfully through the months when the fields themselves offered little.
Bren and Cade walked together down the gentle slope from the settlement toward the fields, tools carried over their shoulders, a wooden-handled hoe for Bren, a simpler digging stick for Cade, along with a woven bag containing a portion of flint sickle blades for later in the season, though this early in the year the fields required tending rather than harvesting. The fields themselves stretched in irregular strips along the valley floor, their boundaries marked not by fences, which were uncommon in this period, but by subtle features: a slight rise in the ground, a line of stones cleared from the soil years earlier and piled at a plot's edge, or simply generations of shared memory about which family worked which stretch of land. Some archaeologists suggest that field boundaries in early farming communities were maintained more through social agreement and repeated use than through physical markers, a pattern difficult to detect directly in the archaeological record, but inferred from the arrangement of settlement and field systems at several well-preserved sites. The einkorn wheat planted the previous month had risen to roughly knee-height, its slender green stalks swaying gently in the morning air. Bren moved along the rows methodically, checking for weeds competing with the young grain, and for any sign of damage from birds or small animals. Weeding was tedious, unglamorous work, but essential. Uncontrolled weeds could significantly reduce a harvest's yield, and a poor harvest, in a world without reliable long-term food storage or trade networks capable of moving large grain surpluses quickly, could mean genuine hunger before the following year's crop came in. Cade worked a neighboring strip, using his digging stick to loosen soil around the base of struggling plants and to turn under weeds before they could establish themselves. At 14, he was old enough to be trusted with meaningful responsibility, and skeletal evidence in adolescent burials in this period sometimes shows early signs of the same physical wear patterns found in adult farmers, suggesting that the transition into full adult labor happened earlier and more gradually than in many societies today. The soil itself required constant attention,
Without modern fertilizers, farmers of this period relied on natural soil fertility, crop rotation where possible, and the periodic use of animal manure spread across fields to help replenish nutrients depleted by repeated planting. Some archaeological evidence suggests early farmers also practiced a form of shifting cultivation, allowing certain fields to lie fallow, or even reverting to grazing land or forest regrowth for a period of years before being cleared and planted again. A practice that helped preserve long-term soil health, even without a formal scientific understanding of why it worked. As the sun rose higher, the pair paused briefly near a low stone marker at the field's edge, sharing water carried from home in a simple clay vessel. From this vantage point, looking out across the valley, Bren could see smoke rising from several neighboring settlements further along the ridge, and the pale green patchwork of other families' fields stretching toward the tree line. Farming in this period, though centered on the household, was never truly isolated. Neighboring communities shared knowledge, occasionally shared labor during particularly demanding tasks like harvest, and, as we will discuss later, exchanged goods along trade routes stretching far beyond what any single family could travel in a lifetime. Clearing new land when it was needed represented one of the most labor-intensive undertakings a community could face. Felling mature forest with stone axes, even when supplemented by fire and ring-barking techniques, could take a group of men many weeks to clear even a modest plot, and the resulting land often required several seasons of cultivation before it produced yields comparable to older, more established fields. Bren's own grandfather, according to family memory passed down through Sela, had helped clear one of the very strips his son now tended, a quiet inheritance of effort stretching back before living memory. By mid-morning, the weeding was well underway, the sun warm on the workers' backs, the fields quiet except for bird song and the occasional low murmur of conversation between father and son. It was steady, unremarkable labor, the kind that built, one ordinary morning at a time, the entire foundation of settled agricultural life. The tools Bren and Cade carried that morning represent a significant, if often underappreciated, technological achievement in their own right. Simple as a wooden hoe or a sharpened digging stick might appear, their design reflected generations of accumulated refinement, balancing weight, durability, and effectiveness against the practical limits of the materials available. Wood, unlike stone or fired clay, rarely survives in the archaeological record except under unusually favorable preservation conditions, meaning our understanding of Neolithic wooden tools heavily depends on rare, well-preserved finds from waterlogged sites where oxygen-poor, saturated soil has allowed organic material to survive far longer than it would under normal conditions. One such well-preserved example, an early wooden ard, a simple scratch plow style implement used to break the soil's surface ahead of planting, offers valuable insight into agricultural techniques that would otherwise remain almost entirely visible to modern researchers. While Bren's household in this reconstruction relies primarily on hand tools rather than an ard pulled by draft animals, the broader trajectory of Neolithic agricultural technology across this period shows a gradual, uneven movement towards exactly this kind of animal-assisted cultivation, a development that would, in later centuries, dramatically reshape the scale and efficiency of European agriculture.
While Bren and Cade worked the fields, Gath, the settlement's elder, made his way toward the pasture land at the valley's edge, where the community's animals grazed under loose but attentive supervision. Though past the heaviest physical labor, Gath remained an active and valued member of the community, and herding, while still demanding, suited a body that had grown less capable of the sustained heavy lifting required elsewhere. The herd itself was modest by later historical standards.
A mixture of cattle, sheep, and goats, along with a small number of pigs that were often allowed to forage more independently near the forest edge, where they fed on roots, acorns, and fallen nuts. Domesticated animals represented an enormous investment of accumulated knowledge and generations of selective breeding, though deliberate systematic breeding practices we associate with later agricultural history were likely far less formalized in this period, relying instead on gradual, practical observation of which animals thrived, bred successfully, and proved useful. Like the region's cultivated crops, none of these domesticated species were native to this particular valley. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs had each been domesticated independently in different regions to the southeast over the course of many centuries before farming communities carrying these animals gradually expanded into Central Europe. Zooarchaeological analysis, the study of animal bones recovered from archaeological sites, allows researchers to track subtle changes in bone size and shape that occurred as wild species were gradually shaped across many generations into more docile, manageable domesticated forms, generally smaller and less aggressive than their wild ancestors. This long process of domestication, unfolding gradually across an enormous span of time before it ever reached this particular settlement, represented one more thread in the deep, largely invisible inheritance that made a single ordinary morning of herding possible for a man like Gath. Cattle held particular importance within the household economy. Beyond meat, they provided milk, hides for clothing and building material, and increasingly during this period across parts of Europe, labor. Evidence from cattle bones at some sites shows wear patterns consistent with pulling loads, suggesting the beginnings of animal traction that would become far more significant in later centuries. Cattle also represented a form of accumulated wealth in societies without currency in the modern sense. A family's herd size may have reflected not only practical food security, but also social standing within the community, though the precise nature of Neolithic wealth and status remains an active area of archaeological research and debate. Sheep and goats required different management, often grazing on rougher terrain unsuitable for cattle or crops, including the edges of cleared forest and hillside slopes too steep for planting. Their wool, though not yet processed with the sophistication of later periods, could be collected and spun into thread, supplementing flax as a source of textile fiber. Goat milk, as mentioned earlier, likely played a meaningful role in the household diet, particularly for children, though again, questions remain about how widely fresh milk was consumed versus processed into more easily digestible forms. Gath moved slowly among the animals, counting them by habit more than necessity, alert to any sign of illness or injury. A limping ewe near the pasture's edge caught his attention, and he approached carefully, running his hands along her leg to check for swelling or a foreign object lodged in her hoof. Veterinary knowledge in the modern sense did not exist, but generations of practical experience had given people like Gath a working understanding of animal health, illness, and injury, built entirely from observation rather than formal study. The relationship between Neolithic farmers and their animals was, in many ways, one of daily physical intimacy rarely experienced by most people today. Animals lived close to human settlements, sometimes sheltering within or adjacent to houses during particularly harsh weather, and the rhythms of milking, herding, and seasonal breeding structured much of the agricultural calendar. This closeness carried risks as well. Zoonotic diseases, transmitted between animals and humans, likely became more common as this close cohabitation increased, though the full scope of this impact remains a subject of ongoing research among archaeologists and paleopathologists studying skeletal evidence for signs of disease. By midday, satisfied that the herd was healthy and well-fed, Gath settled on a low outcrop of stone at the pasture's edge, watching the animals graze and the fields below, where he could just make out the distant figures of Bren and Cade continuing their work. It was a quiet, watchful kind of labor, suited for a man who had spent decades learning the particular temperament of this land, this herd, and the families that depended on both.
Isotopic analyses of animal bones recovered from Neolithic settlement sites, a technique that examines chemical signatures preserved within bone tissue to infer diet and, in some cases, geographic origin, has allowed researchers to reconstruct grazing patterns with a level of detail that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of archaeologists. Such studies suggest that herds in some regions were moved seasonally between different pasture areas, a practice sometimes called transhumance, allowing communities to make efficient use of varied terrain across the changing seasons while giving heavily grazed pastures time to recover. Whether Gath's community practiced this kind of seasonal movement in its fullest form remains uncertain, but the underlying logic, using the landscape's variety wisely rather than depleting a single area through constant grazing, would likely have been familiar to any experienced herder of this period. The bond between herder and herd, built through daily, repeated contact, likely extended beyond simple economic management into something resembling genuine familiarity with individual animals. Modern herders in small-scale agricultural and pastoral communities frequently describe recognizing individual animals by temperament, gait, and subtle behavioral quirks, a form of practical knowledge that leaves no direct trace in the archaeological record, but seems, on the basis of broad cross-cultural comparison, a reasonable and plausible feature of Gath's own relationship with the animals under his care. Back near the settlement, Naya's morning had settled into its own rhythm, distinct from the heavier labor undertaken by the adults, but no less purposeful. Childhood in Neolithic farming communities was not a period of leisure separated from adult responsibility, as it is often understood in much of the modern world. Instead, evidence suggests children were gradually and continuously integrated into household labor, learning skills through direct observation and participation rather than through anything resembling formal instruction. After helping sort grain earlier that morning, Naya had been given a new task, accompanying Sela to gather kindling and small edible plants from the forest edge nearest the settlement, an area still close enough to be considered safe for a 7-year-old, but far enough to offer genuine variety beyond the cleared fields. This kind of foraging, though secondary to farming in terms of overall calories provided, remained a meaningful supplement to the household diet throughout the Neolithic period, and archaeobotanical remains from many sites confirm the continued use of wild plants, nuts, berries, greens, and roots alongside cultivated grain, even in fully established farming communities. Sela moved through the underbrush with practiced ease, pointing out plants as she went, naming them in a quiet, unhurried voice that Naya had learned to listen to carefully. Some plants were gathered for food, others for their usefulness in treating minor injuries or illness, a body of practical herbal knowledge that, in the absence of writing, existed only in living memory,
passed from elder to child through repeated demonstration across many years. The loss of even a single knowledgeable elder without adequate opportunity to pass on this accumulated understanding could represent a genuine and difficult loss for a community's collective knowledge. Naya's task was simple: collect dry, easily snapped branches suitable for kindling, and set aside any of the specific plants her grandmother had shown her, taking care to leave enough of each patch to allow it to continue growing. This early practical understanding of sustainable harvesting, leaving enough of a resource to regenerate, likely developed not from any abstract philosophy, but from generations of direct, repeated experience with what happened when a patch was harvested too aggressively. Not far away, other children from neighboring households worked at similar tasks, sometimes independently, sometimes in small, loosely supervised groups. Play and labor were not always sharply divided in this world. A child gathering kindling might also chase after a sibling between tasks, or pause to examine an insect, or invent a small game involving throwing pebbles at a marked tree. Archaeologists have found small, worn pebbles and simple carved objects at some Neolithic sites that may represent toys, though interpreting the exact function of such small, ambiguous artifacts remains genuinely difficult, and caution is warranted before assuming too much about their purpose. By the time the sun had climbed well above the tree line, Naya and Sela made their way back toward the settlement, arms laden with kindling and a small woven bag of foraged greens destined for the evening meal. Along the way, Sela paused near a fallen log to point out a cluster of small mushrooms, explaining carefully in the same patient tone she used for everything which were safe and which were not. Knowledge that, for a child growing up in this landscape, could genuinely mean the difference between a minor mistake and a serious illness. This slow, embedded process of learning, not through lecture, but through years of quiet accompaniment, represented the primary educational system of Neolithic childhood. There were no separate schools, no formal instructors. Instead, knowledge passed continuously between generations through shared labor, observation, and the patient repetition of a grandmother naming plants along a familiar forest path, one ordinary morning after another.
Skeletal evidence from Neolithic child burials, while naturally a sensitive subject, offers researchers a cautious but genuine window into the physical realities of childhood in this period. Growth patterns visible in bone development suggest that most children faced periodic nutritional stress, likely tied to the seasonal availability of food and the occasional hardship of a poor harvest, rather than chronic, severe deprivation. This pattern is broadly consistent with what we might expect from a farming society still relatively close, in historical terms, to its hunting and foraging origins, retaining a degree of dietary flexibility that likely helped buffer against the sharpest edges of agricultural risk. For a child like Nia, this meant a life that was neither uniformly harsh nor uniformly comfortable, but variable, shaped by the particular fortunes of a given season, and by the accumulated resilience of a household that had, across multiple generations, learned to manage risk through careful storage, varied food sources, and close cooperation with neighboring families facing similar seasonal pressures. The presence of multiple children of varying ages across the settlement meant that learning was rarely a strictly one-on-one experience between a single adult and a single child. Older children, like Cade, likely played an informal but genuine role in guiding younger ones, including children from neighboring households, through simpler tasks appropriate to their age and ability. This layered structure of learning, grandparent to parent, parent to older child to younger child, created a kind of redundancy within the community's knowledge system, helping ensure that essential skills and practical wisdom continued to circulate even if any single individual's ability to teach was, for whatever reason, temporarily unavailable. Such informal peer teaching among children leaves essentially no direct archaeological trace, and any description of it necessarily draws more heavily on broad anthropological comparison than on physical evidence specific to this period and place. Still, the pattern is common enough across many small-scale agricultural and foraging societies studied by anthropologists in more recent history that its inclusion here represents a reasonable, carefully qualified inference rather than pure invention.
At the edge of the settlement, in a modest lean-to structure attached to his own house, Oren sat surrounded by the tools of his craft, a scattered collection of flint nodules, antler tines used as pressure tools, and a scattering of stone flakes covering the ground around him like fallen leaves. Tool-making, though practiced to some degree by most adults in a farming community, had, in Oren's case, developed into something closer to genuine specialization, and neighboring families frequently brought him raw material in exchange for finished tools of a quality difficult to achieve without years of dedicated practice. The process of shaping stone tools, known to archaeologists as knapping, required both physical skill and an intimate understanding of how different stone types fractured under controlled pressure. Flint, prized above most other stone for its predictable, sharp-edged breakage, did not naturally occur in every region, meaning communities without direct access to flint deposits often relied on trade to obtain workable material, a subject we will return to shortly. Oren selected a flint nodule from the pile beside him, turning it slowly in his hands, examining its shape and the faint internal lines that would guide how it might eventually split. Using a hammerstone, he struck the nodule with careful, controlled blows, removing large flakes to establish a rough working shape, a technique requiring years to master safely, since a poorly aimed strike could shatter valuable material, or worse, send sharp fragments flying toward the toolmaker's hands and face. Once the rough shape had been established, Oren switched to a smaller antler tine, using it to apply precise pressure along the stone's edges, removing tiny, controlled flakes to refine the tool's shape and sharpen its cutting edge. This pressure flaking technique, well documented through both archaeological analysis and modern experimental replication, allowed skilled toolmakers to produce remarkably fine, sharp implements: sickle blades for harvesting grain, scrapers for preparing hides, small blades for cutting and carving, and axe heads for the heavier work of clearing land. The particular tool taking shape beneath Oren's hands that morning was a sickle blade, destined for the coming harvest season still some weeks away. Neolithic sickles typically consisted of several small flint blades set into a wooden or antler haft, using a natural adhesive, often birch bark tar, which archaeologists have identified through chemical analysis at numerous sites, one of several examples of sophisticated material knowledge developed by Neolithic communities long before any formal understanding of chemistry existed in the modern sense.
Tool-making of this kind was not merely functional, it also represented accumulated social value. A skilled toolmaker like Orun occupied a position of quiet importance within the community, his labor essential to the practical functioning of farming, building, and food processing across multiple households.
Archaeological evidence from some Neolithic sites suggests certain individuals or households did specialize more heavily in particular crafts, exchanging finished goods for grain, animal products, or assistance with other labor, hinting at economic relationships more complex than a purely self-sufficient household model might suggest. As the morning progressed, Orun was joined briefly by Cade, sent by his father to collect a repaired hoe blade Orun had been reshaping over the previous days. The two exchanged a few quiet words, and Orun, without particular ceremony, allowed the boy to examine the sickle blade taking shape, pointing out the angle of the strikes and the careful control required to avoid ruining the material. Whether this brief exchange represented anything resembling a formal apprenticeship or simply the ordinary curiosity of a community where skills were shared openly among neighbors is impossible to say with certainty. What remains clear from the archaeological record is that skilled craftsmanship, much like agricultural knowledge, depended entirely on this kind of direct, patient transmission from one generation and one pair of hands to the next. Experimental archaeology, a research approach in which modern specialists attempt to replicate ancient techniques using period-appropriate tools and materials, has proven especially valuable in understanding crafts like Orun's. By learning to knap flint themselves, often through years of dedicated practice, researchers have gained a far deeper appreciation for the sheer skill embedded in even a seemingly simple stone blade, along with a more grounded understanding of how long particular tasks likely took, how frequently toolmakers might have failed or wasted material, and how physically demanding sustained knapping work could be on the hands and forearms over time. This kind of practical, hands-on research has also helped correct earlier, less charitable assumptions sometimes made by Stone Age technology by scholars working purely from theoretical description. Far from crude or primitive, the flaking techniques employed by skilled Neolithic toolmakers required a level of spatial reasoning, material understanding, and physical control that modern practitioners often describe as genuinely difficult to master, even with the benefit of detailed instruction unavailable to someone like Orun, who would have learned entirely through years of direct observation and repeated practice under the guidance of an older toolmaker before him.
Not far from Orun's workspace, near a small clearing shielded from the wind, another craft was underway, one equally essential to daily life, though requiring an entirely different set of skills. Pottery making, though it had arrived in this region somewhat later than farming itself, had by this period become a well-established household craft, and the storage vessels, cooking pots, and simple bowls it produced played a central role in nearly every aspect of domestic life. An older woman from a neighboring household, whom we might imagine working alongside Sella on many previous occasions, knelt beside a small pit dug into the earth, surrounded by lumps of prepared clay resting beneath a damp cloth to prevent them from drying prematurely. Clay of suitable quality was not always available locally, and communities often traveled some distance to specific deposits known through generations of accumulated local knowledge, or, in some cases, obtained prepared clay through the same broader exchange networks that carried flint and other valuable materials across the landscape. The pottery-making process began with careful preparation of the clay itself, kneaded thoroughly to remove air pockets, and mixed with tempering material, crushed stone, shell, or organic matter, such as chopped plant fiber, which helped prevent the finished vessel from cracking during firing.
This period predates the invention of the pottery wheel in this region by many centuries. Vessels were instead built entirely by hand, most commonly using a coiling technique, in which long, even ropes of clay were layered one atop another and carefully smoothed together to build up the walls of a pot. Working with practiced, unhurried hands, the potter shaped a mid-sized storage vessel, its walls gradually rising as she added coil after coil, smoothing each join with a wetted finger or a simple bone or wooden tool. The rim was finished with careful attention, since a poorly shaped opening could compromise the vessel's usefulness for sealing and storage. Decoration, where it appeared, was often simple but deliberate: incised lines, impressed patterns made with a comb-like tool or twisted cord, or small applied bumps of clay arranged in repeating patterns around the vessel's shoulder. Pottery styles in this period varied meaningfully between regions and communities, and archaeologists have long used these variations, the particular combination of shapes, decorative techniques, and clay preparation methods, to trace connections and distinctions between different Neolithic cultural groups across Europe. A pot's design, in other words, carried information not unlike a dialect or a style of dress, marking, whether consciously or not, a community's particular place within a broader cultural landscape.
Once shaped, the vessel required careful, slow drying before firing, since any remaining moisture could cause it to crack or explode when exposed to heat. Firing itself, in the absence of purpose-built kilns, which would not become common in this region until later periods, was typically accomplished using an open bonfire technique, carefully layering fuel around the dried vessels and maintaining the fire for an extended period to reach and sustain the temperatures needed to properly harden the clay. This process required real skill and experience. Too rapid a temperature change or uneven heat distribution could destroy hours of careful craftsmanship in moments. The finished vessels, once cooled, served an enormous range of purposes throughout the household: storing grain and dried foods, holding water, cooking over the hearth, and, in some cases, accompanying the dead in burial, a practice archaeologists have documented at numerous Neolithic cemetery sites, though the specific meaning attached to grave goods likely varied between communities and periods, and firm conclusions about belief or intention remain appropriately cautious. By midday, several finished vessels sat drying nearby, awaiting their turn in the next firing, evidence of a craft that, much like tool-making, depended entirely on patient skill accumulated across a lifetime and passed carefully from one set of hands to the next. Residue analysis, a laboratory technique that examines chemical traces absorbed into the porous walls of ancient pottery, has opened a remarkable window into Neolithic diet and food preparation, revealing information that would otherwise be entirely invisible. Traces of milk fats, plant lipids, and even the byproducts of fermentation have been identified within pottery fragments from sites across this broader period, offering direct chemical evidence for practices, dairy processing, food storage, perhaps even early fermented beverages, that written sources, had they existed, might never have thought worth recording in detail. This kind of evidence reminds us that pottery, however humble it might appear as a craft, functioned as something close to a technological platform underpinning much of Neolithic domestic life,
enabling storage, transport, and cooking methods simply unavailable to communities relying solely on containers made from wood, hide, or woven basketry. The potter, working quietly near the settlement's edge that afternoon, was not merely producing household objects. She was sustaining one of the essential technologies that made settled farming life, with its need for reliable long-term food storage, genuinely workable. As the sun approached its highest point, a small commotion near the settlement's edge drew brief attention. A traveler, accompanied by a single pack animal, had arrived from the direction of the river path, carrying goods for exchange. Trade, though it might seem an unlikely feature of an otherwise self-sufficient farming settlement, played a genuinely significant role in Neolithic life, connecting even modest, seemingly isolated communities to a much wider network of peoples, materials, and ideas. The traveler carried, among other items, a small supply of high-quality flint from a distant quarry region, along with several polished stone axe heads made from a particular greenish stone not locally available, a material archaeologists have traced through careful chemical and geological analysis to specific quarry sites, sometimes located hundreds of kilometers from where the finished tools were eventually discovered. Such long-distance movement of valued materials, achieved without wheeled transport across most of this landscape, and often relying instead on river travel, pack animals, and simple foot journeys passed between successive communities, represents one of the more genuinely remarkable aspects of Neolithic life, frequently underappreciated by those imagining early farming societies as entirely isolated and static. Goth, drawn by the news of the traveler's arrival, made his way from the pasture to oversee, in his informal capacity as a respected elder, the exchange taking place. Neolithic trade in this period likely operated without anything resembling currency in the modern sense. Instead, exchange probably functioned through direct barter, supplemented by social obligations and relationships built and maintained over repeated visits and exchanges across many years. A traveler passing through a particular settlement regularly might develop something resembling an ongoing trading relationship with specific households, exchanging goods not as isolated transactions, but as part of a continuing social connection. In exchange for several flint nodules and one of the polished axe heads, the settlement offered surplus grain, carefully stored from the previous year's harvest, along with a quantity of prepared flax fiber, valued by communities in regions less suited for its cultivation. Such exchanges, multiplied across many settlements and many years, gradually built the extensive trade networks that archaeologists have traced across Neolithic Europe through the careful sourcing of materials found far from their points of origin. The traveler also brought something less tangible, but equally valuable: news. Word of a poor harvest 2 valleys over, rumors of a new settlement being established further downriver, a description of unusually severe flooding experienced during his journey. In a world without writing, and therefore without any means of recording or transmitting information beyond direct spoken communication, traveling individuals like this one served as crucial threads connecting otherwise separate communities, carrying knowledge as valuable in its own way as the physical goods exchanged alongside it. Children gathered at a respectful distance, curious about the visitor and his goods, while adults conducted the more serious business of negotiation. Nia, having returned from foraging with Sela,
watched with particular interest as the polished axe head changed hands, its surface catching the midday light in a way distinctly different from the duller, more common local stone she was accustomed to seeing. By early afternoon, the exchange complete, the traveler continued along the river path toward the next settlement, his pack animal now carrying grain and flax rather than flint and stone. The encounter, brief and in the context of a full day's labor relatively minor, nonetheless represented something significant, proof that even a modest farming household on a quiet ridge above a river existed within a far larger, interconnected world, one whose full extent no single person within it could likely have fully comprehended, yet whose evidence remains traceable today through the careful, patient work of modern archaeology. The specific greenish stone used for the traveler's polished axe heads, sourced from a distant quarry region, illustrates a broader pattern researchers have identified across much of Neolithic Europe. Certain particularly valued materials appear to have circulated across genuinely vast distances, moving between communities through repeated, incremental exchanges rather than any single long journey undertaken by one individual. A single axe head might pass through the hands of several successive traders and households over the course of years before finally reaching a settlement like Bren's, its origin gradually becoming less a matter of direct knowledge and more a kind of half-remembered reputation. A stone known to come from somewhere far to the south, valued and traded in turn by people who might themselves have only a vague sense of its precise place of origin. This layered, indirect quality of Neolithic trade complicates any simple picture of isolated farming communities existing in complete self-sufficiency. Even without formal markets, currency, or centralized authority to organize exchange, these networks proved remarkably effective at moving valued materials across considerable distances, driven by the accumulated, decentralized decisions of countless individual households like Bren's, each making a small, practical choice to trade surplus grain for a well-made tool. As the sun reached its highest point, the scattered members of the household began, gradually and without any formal signal, to make their way back toward the longhouse for the midday meal, a natural pause in the day's labor, common across most agricultural societies, ancient and modern alike, when the sun's heat made continued heavy work in the open fields less practical. Bren and Cade returned first, dust and soil marking their hands and knees from the morning's weeding. Gath followed shortly after, leaving the herd temporarily under the loose watch of a neighboring household's younger son. Oren, setting aside his tool-making, and the potter, banking her fire to preserve it for the afternoon's continued work, likewise made their way toward their respective homes. The midday meal itself was typically simpler than the fuller preparation of the morning, often consisting of the remaining bread from breakfast, supplemented by whatever foraged greens Nia and Sella had gathered, along with, when available, a portion of cheese or preserved meat from the household stores. Archaeological evidence for meal patterns in this period remains admittedly somewhat indirect, drawn largely from combined analysis of food remains, storage vessel residues, and comparison with better documented agricultural societies from later periods. But the general pattern of a lighter midday meal, bracketed by more substantial morning and evening meals, appears consistent across much of the available evidence.
This midday pause, brief as it was, served an important physical function beyond simple nutrition. Sustained heavy labor under direct sun carried genuine risks of heat exhaustion, and a period of rest and shade during the day's hottest hours likely represented practical wisdom accumulated across generations of agricultural experience, even without any formal understanding of the physiological reasons behind it.
For the younger children, this pause also offered a brief period of genuine rest. Pell, tired from the morning's activity, settled into a light sleep in the shade near Sella, while Nia sat quietly beside her mother, eating slowly and watching the activity of the settlement around her. Smoke rising from cooking fires at neighboring houses, the distant figures of other families similarly gathered for their own midday meal, the occasional call of a bird passing overhead. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns across the Neolithic period have noted that houses within a single community were often positioned closely enough to allow this kind of visual and social connection between households, suggesting that daily life, even within the private space of individual family homes, remained closely woven into the broader rhythms of community life. A midday meal, in other words, was rarely a fully isolated event. It existed within full view and full awareness of the wider settlement's own parallel rhythms. The particular composition of this midday meal, drawing together stored foods from the previous year's harvest with freshly foraged greens gathered only hours earlier, illustrates a broader pattern in Neolithic subsistence that researchers sometimes describe as a mixed or supplemented agricultural economy. Rather than relying exclusively on cultivated crops, most farming households throughout this period continued to draw meaningfully on wild resources, whether foraged plants, fish from nearby rivers, or occasionally hunted game, blending their relatively new agricultural lifestyle with practices inherited from the hunting and foraging traditions of earlier generations. This flexibility likely provided genuine nutritional and practical benefits, offering some buffer against the risks of relying too heavily on any single food source in a world without reliable long-distance food transport or storage beyond a single season. As the meal drew to a close and the sun began its slow afternoon descent, the household prepared once again to separate for the remaining hours of daylight. There remained fields to tend, tools to finish, animals to check, and, as the day progressed toward evening, the beginning of preparations for the more substantial meal that would mark the household's return together as darkness approached. Before rising, Bren lingered a moment longer in the shade, watching Pell sleep and half listening to the distant sound of the community's herds moving somewhere beyond view. Moments like this, brief and largely undocumented by the physical evidence that survives from this period, remind us that Neolithic daily life, however dominated by demanding physical labor, was not without its own small pockets of quiet rest and simple domestic contentment. Archaeology can trace the tools, the fields, and the food. It can only gesture carefully and speculatively toward the ordinary human experience of a father resting briefly beside his sleeping child in the warm shade of a summer afternoon. Sella, meanwhile, used the pause to check the condition of the drying herbs and plant material gathered on previous days, laid out along a shaded ledge near the house's exterior wall. Preserving food and medicinal plants for use later in the year required careful attention to drying conditions, and a sudden, unexpected rain shower could easily ruin days of careful collection if not properly protected. One more small, continuous task woven into the household's daily rhythm.
easy to overlook and yet essential to the family's well-being across the full span of the year.
The afternoon brought a shift in the household's labor as tasks requiring less direct sun exposure moved to the forefront. Ilva, having spent much of the morning on food preparation, turned her attention to textile work, a category of labor that, though leaving relatively little direct trace in the archaeological record compared to stone tools or pottery, represented an enormous and essential investment of time within Neolithic households. Flax, grown in the household's fields alongside the grain crops, provided the primary source of fiber for cloth production in this region during this period, supplemented, as mentioned earlier, by wool from the community's sheep, though wool processing techniques were likely still developing in sophistication compared to later periods. Producing usable thread from raw flax required a lengthy, multi-stage process. The plants had to be harvested, dried, and then subjected to a process called retting, in which the stalks were soaked in water for an extended period to break down the outer plant material and free the inner fibers, which were then dried again, beaten to separate remaining plant matter, and finally combed into workable strands. Ilva settled near the longhouses' entrance, where the light remained good without the full heat of direct sun, and began the careful work of spinning prepared flax fiber into thread, using a simple spindle weighted with a small perforated stone disc, an object archaeologists refer to as a spindle whorl, found in significant numbers at Neolithic sites across Europe, and representing one of the clearest pieces of direct, physical evidence for textile production during this period. The spindle was set spinning with a practiced flick of the wrist, drawing and twisting fiber into an increasingly long, even thread as it rotated. This work required sustained concentration and fine motor control, and, much like grinding grain, likely consumed a considerable portion of women's daily labor across the Neolithic period, even though the finished cloth itself, along with the tools most directly associated with its production, wooden looms, spindles, and the flax and wool fibers themselves, rarely survive well in the archaeological record compared to more durable materials like stone and fired clay. This creates what archaeologists sometimes describe as a significant gap in the physical evidence, likely leading to an underestimation in popular understanding of just how much daily labor was devoted to textile production throughout this period. Nearby, Sella worked at a separate but related task, scraping and preparing an animal hide taken from a recently slaughtered goat, working it with a bone scraper to remove remaining fat and tissue before the hide would be treated further to soften it for eventual use as clothing or a covering. This process, like flax preparation, involved multiple careful stages and considerable physical effort, and the tools used, stone and bone scrapers found in abundance at Neolithic sites, provide some of the clearest direct archaeological evidence for this otherwise perishable aspect of daily craft. The finished textiles and prepared hides produced through this ongoing labor served essential practical purposes: clothing suited for the region's cool, damp climate, bedding materials, and various forms of storage and carrying bags necessary for the countless small logistical tasks of daily agricultural life. Though we cannot know with certainty what Neolithic clothing in this specific region actually looked like in detail, since so little direct textile evidence survives, careful examination of spindle whorls, loom weights, and rare fragments of preserved fiber from unusually favorable burial conditions in other parts of Europe allows archaeologists to construct reasonable, if necessarily incomplete, reconstructions. As the afternoon progressed, Naya, returned from her earlier foraging duties, sat beside her mother, attempting, with the uneven concentration typical of a child her age, to practice a simplified version of the spinning technique under Ilva's patient guidance. It was slow going, the thread emerging thick and uneven compared to her mother's practiced work, but this too represented an essential part of how skills were transmitted across generations in a world without any form of formal instruction. Patient repetition, gentle correction, and the gradual accumulation of competence across many such afternoons. Dye evidence from later prehistoric periods, along with rare preserved textile fragments recovered from exceptional burial and bog conditions elsewhere in Europe, suggests that Neolithic communities likely possessed at least some capacity to color cloth using plant-based dyes, though direct evidence for this specific region and period remains limited. It would be inaccurate to claim with confidence that Ilva's household produced brightly dyed textiles, but it would be equally inaccurate to assume their clothing was uniformly plain. The honest answer, once again, is that much of this dimension of daily life remains genuinely uncertain, obscured by the simple biological fact that organic fiber decays quickly under most burial conditions. What survives more reliably are the tools themselves: spindle whorls, loom weights, bone needles, and awls scattered across excavated house floors in quantities that suggest textile production was neither occasional nor marginal, but a sustained, near-constant undertaking, occupying a significant share of the household's collective labor across the full working year, every bit as essential to survival as the grain growing steadily in the fields beyond. As the afternoon progressed, father and son were joined briefly by a neighboring farmer whose own fields lay adjacent to theirs, and the two men paused their separate work to discuss, in the unhurried manner typical of people accustomed to long days of physical labor, the condition of their respective crops, and a shared concern about a recent period of unusually dry weather. Cooperation and mutual observation between neighboring households, evident in patterns of settlement organization uncovered by archaeologists across many Neolithic sites, likely served an important practical function, allowing farmers to compare notes, share concerns, and, when necessary, coordinate labor for tasks too large for a single household to manage efficiently on its own. By the time the sun had begun its final descent toward the western ridge, casting long shadows across the fields, Bren and Cade gathered their tools, satisfied with the day's progress, and began the walk back toward the settlement. Behind them, the fields lay quiet in the gathering evening light, the pale green wheat swaying gently, another day's careful attention added to the long, patient accumulation of labor that would, in the coming weeks, determine whether the household faced a winter of comfortable sufficiency or genuine hardship. Archaeobotanists analyzing charred grain recovered from Neolithic storage contexts have been able, in some cases, to identify evidence of crop diseases and pest infestations affecting ancient harvests, offering a sobering, direct window into the very risks Bren and Cade worked so diligently to prevent. Fungal infections capable of damaging stored grain, along with insect pests drawn to accumulated food stores, represented persistent threats that no amount of careful field work alone could fully eliminate, meaning household survival depended not only on successfully growing a crop, but on successfully protecting it afterward through careful drying, secure storage, and constant watchful attention. This layered vulnerability
present at every stage from planting to final storage helps explain the sheer volume of daily labor devoted to agriculture throughout this period, and offers a useful corrective to any tendency to romanticize early farming life as simple or effortless. Every gently swaying stalk of wheat in the field behind Bren and Cade represented quite literally a small hedge against hunger, earned through sustained, careful attention rather than left to chance.
As evening approached and the household's various tasks began drawing to a natural close, it is worth pausing to consider an aspect of Neolithic life that resists easy or confident description: the spiritual and religious beliefs held by communities like this one. Archaeological evidence for belief systems in this period is genuinely fragmentary, and historians and archaeologists continue to debate, sometimes quite seriously, how confidently we can interpret the physical evidence that does survive. What we can observe with reasonable confidence includes patterns in burial practices, the presence of certain types of objects, small clay figurines, sometimes interpreted as representing fertility or ancestral figures, though this interpretation remains genuinely contested among researchers. And at some sites across Europe from this broader period, monumental structures whose construction clearly required significant, coordinated communal effort beyond what any single household could achieve alone, suggesting shared belief or purpose extending beyond individual family units. For a settlement of the modest scale imagined in this documentary, direct evidence of formal religious structures or specialized ritual spaces is less clear, and it would be inaccurate to suggest with confidence that this particular community engaged in elaborate ceremonial practice. What seems more broadly supported by evidence from comparable Neolithic farming communities is a set of practices tied closely to the practical rhythms of agricultural life: attention to seasonal transitions, careful treatment of the dead, and, in some documented cases, deliberate placement of certain objects, including tools or pottery, in ways that some archaeologists interpret as carrying ritual or symbolic significance, distinct from purely practical explanations. Burial practices themselves varied considerably across different Neolithic communities and periods, but many sites show evidence of careful, deliberate treatment of the dead, bodies positioned in particular postures, sometimes accompanied by pottery vessels, tools, or personal ornaments, and occasionally buried beneath or near the family home itself, a practice some researchers have connected to a possible belief in ongoing connection between living households and deceased ancestors, though, again, this interpretation should be understood as a reasonable hypothesis rather than a settled fact. For Sella, watching the sky begin to deepen toward evening, we might reasonably imagine some quiet awareness of the changing seasons, an attentiveness to natural cycles that shaped nearly every aspect of the household's practical survival: planting, harvest, the movement of animals to and from pasture, the lengthening and shortening of days across the year. Whether this awareness carried explicitly spiritual or religious meaning for her, in any sense we might recognize today, is simply not something the archaeological evidence allows us to state with confidence. What can be said, cautiously and honestly, is this: people in this period, like people throughout human history, almost certainly grappled in some form with questions surrounding death, the natural world's cycles, and their own place within a landscape shaped as much by ancestors and tradition as by immediate practical necessity. The specific shape those beliefs took,
the stories told, the meanings attached to particular practices, the nature of any relationship imagined between the living and the dead, or between people and the wider natural world, remains, for the most part, genuinely unknown to us, hidden behind the simple fact that these communities left no written record of their inner lives. This uncertainty, rather than representing a gap to be filled with confident invention, deserves to be acknowledged honestly as part of this reconstruction. The physical world of Bren and Ilva's household, its fields, its tools, its careful daily labor, rests on genuinely strong archaeological evidence. Their inner world, their beliefs, their private understanding of the forces shaping their lives remains, appropriately, held at a respectful distance, acknowledged as real and significant, but not claimed with more certainty than the evidence allows. Elsewhere across Neolithic Europe, larger and more elaborate monumental sites, earthworks, chambered tombs, and in later centuries, the great stone circles that would eventually rise across parts of the continent, demonstrate that some communities, at certain times and places, were capable of organizing labor on a scale far beyond the needs of any single household, apparently in service of purposes that were not purely practical or agricultural. These monuments, though built by different, often more populous societies than the modest settlement imagined in this documentary, nonetheless suggest that the capacity for shared belief, coordinated communal effort, and some form of collective meaning-making was clearly present within the broader Neolithic world, even if we cannot say with confidence exactly how or whether that capacity expressed itself within Bren and Ilva's own particular valley. It is precisely this tension, genuine evidence of profound human capacity for shared meaning and monumental cooperation elsewhere, set against the comparative silence of a smaller, more ordinary settlement like this one, that makes honest historical reconstruction so difficult and so worthwhile. We are left, appropriately, with questions rather than answers, and with a quiet respect for lives lived fully, meaningfully, within a framework of belief we can only glimpse indirectly through the patient, careful work of archaeology. As the sun finally dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and deepening blue, the scattered members of the household made their way back toward the longhouse, drawn together by the familiar, practical rhythm of evening. This gradual convergence, repeated countless times across countless similar days, represented one of the most consistent patterns of Neolithic domestic life. A day spent largely dispersed across separate tasks, drawing back together as darkness approached. Inside, the hearth fire, banked low through the afternoon, was built back up, its renewed light and warmth filling the interior as the outside world darkened. Ilva and Sella turned their attention to preparing the evening meal, the most substantial of the day, typically including the remaining stored food supplemented by anything gathered or produced during the day's labor. Perhaps a portion of the foraged greens collected that morning, alongside grain porridge or bread, and on occasions when the household stores allowed, a modest portion of meat or cheese. Bren and Cade, returning from the fields, paused to wash road dust and dirt from their hands and faces, using water carried in a simple clay vessel, before settling near the fire as the meal came together. Gath, having secured the herd for the night in a fenced enclosure near the settlement's edge, joined the gathering shortly after, along with, on this particular evening, Oren, who often shared the evening meal with neighboring households in a loose, informal rotation that helped strengthen the practical bonds of cooperation running throughout the settlement. As the meal wound down and the fire's light became the primary source of illumination within the darkening house, the evening often included quieter, less structured activity. Sela occasionally recounting stories or practical knowledge to the younger children, passed down through her own memory of her mother's and grandmother's teachings. Oren, before returning to his own home, sometimes sharing news gathered from his own conversations with neighboring craftsmen or travelers passing through the region. Bren and Gath discussing in low, unhurried voices plans for the coming day's work.
We should be careful in imagining these evening gatherings, not to overstate their similarity to modern ideas of storytelling or entertainment. The archaeological evidence supports the general pattern of shared evening meals and communal domestic space, but the specific content of conversation and whether it included anything resembling formalized oral tradition or storytelling in the way we might imagine remains, like much of Neolithic inner life, beyond what physical evidence alone can confirm. What we can reasonably suggest, based on broader anthropological understanding of small-scale agricultural societies, is that evening gatherings around a shared hearth likely represented an important, consistent thread of social connection, knowledge transmission, and simple companionship at the close of each demanding day. Oren's presence at the family's evening meal, informal and unremarkable as it might have seemed to those involved, points to a wider pattern of practical cooperation binding this settlement together across the working year. Beyond the direct exchange of goods for labor, neighboring households likely relied on one another for larger seasonal tasks, assistance during harvest, help raising a new house frame, or extra hands when illness or injury temporarily reduced a household's own capacity to manage its full workload. Archaeologists studying the layout of Neolithic settlements have noted that houses were rarely spaced so far apart as to discourage this kind of frequent casual interaction, suggesting that whatever formal or informal systems governed cooperation in this period, physical proximity itself played a meaningful role in sustaining the practical, everyday bonds a farming community depended on to function successfully across good years and difficult ones alike. As the fire settled and the youngest members of the household, Pel first, then gradually Nia, grew visibly tired, the gathering began, without particular ceremony, to wind toward its natural conclusion. Orun took his leave, making his way back to his own house under the emerging stars. The rest of the household began the quiet, familiar routine of preparing for sleep. The particular arrangement of hearth, sleeping areas, and storage space in longhouses across this period suggests that evening domestic life was organized around the fire, not merely for warmth and light, but as the natural gravitational center of the household's shared attention, much as it likely had been for countless generations before this one, stretching back to long before farming itself, to the fires of hunting and foraging ancestors gathered beneath open sky rather than a timber roof. In this sense, the hearth Sela tended so carefully each morning and evening connected this household to an extraordinarily long thread of human continuity, one running far deeper into the past than farming, pottery, or even the wooden walls surrounding it that night. As the youngest children drifted toward sleep, the adults remaining near the fire's glow spoke more quietly, their conversations slowing to match the day's own gradual conclusion.
There was comfort, presumably, in this repetition. The same fire, the same voices, the same familiar shapes settling into rest around a hearth that likely outlived more than one earlier version of itself, rebuilt and relit across the household's own long, continuous history on this particular ridge above the river. The last tasks of the day were small ones. Sella banked the fire carefully, arranging the coals to preserve embers through the night for the following morning's relighting, a small, practiced act repeated so many times across her life that it required no real conscious thought. Ylva settled Pell into the sleeping area at the quieter end of the house, the toddler already drowsy from the day's activity, while Nia, despite her own tiredness, lingered a moment longer near the fire's fading light, watching the last visible flames shrink slowly into a steady, glowing bed of coals. Outside, the settlement had grown quiet, the earlier evening sounds of neighboring households settling gradually into stillness. A faint breeze moved through the thatch overhead, and somewhere beyond the cleared fields an owl called once into the deepening darkness. The stars, unobscured by any light beyond scattered hearth fires, would have appeared with a clarity difficult to fully imagine from most places in the modern world, spread in dense, uninterrupted bands across the night sky above the valley. Bren checked once more from the doorway that the animals were secure for the night, and that no obvious threat, whether predator or otherwise, required immediate attention. Satisfied, he made his way back inside, settling near Ylva, as the household one by one gave in to the day's accumulated tiredness. It is worth reflecting, briefly, on just how much labor, skill, and accumulated knowledge had shaped even this single, ordinary day. A hearth carefully maintained since before dawn, grain ground into bread, fields tended with knowledge passed down across generations, tools shaped with patient, practiced skill, pottery built coil by careful coil, textiles spun thread by thread, a trade exchange connecting this quiet valley to distant quarries and workshops far beyond what any single family member would likely ever personally visit. And beneath all of it, questions about belief, meaning, and the unseen world that remain, appropriately, held with humility rather than false certainty.
None of this labor would have felt remarkable to the people living it. It was simply life. Demanding, certainly, and shaped by real uncertainty about weather, harvest, and health, but also structured by deep familiarity, by the comfort of long-practiced routine, and by the quiet presence of family and community surrounding nearly every task from dawn until dark. The archaeological record left behind by communities like this one is, in its own way, remarkably rich. Post holes marking the outline of homes, charred grain preserving evidence of ancient harvests, worn stone tools speaking to countless hours of careful craftsmanship, pottery fragments carrying traces of meals shared and stored across many generations. And yet, for all this physical evidence, so much remains genuinely unknown. The sound of voices around this particular hearth, the specific stories told across many such evenings, the private thoughts and feelings of the people who lived this life, felt this fire's warmth, and watched, as we imagine Naya doing now, the same slow settling of embers into quiet, glowing rest. Tonight, in this reconstructed valley, the fire burns low. The fields lie quiet beneath a clear sky. Somewhere nearby, animals shift gently in their enclosure, and within the longhouse's dark, smoke-scented interior, a family sleeps,
much as families have slept for countless generations before them and countless generations since, tired from honest labor, warmed by a fire carefully tended, and quietly, unknowingly, part of a much longer human story that continues in its own way still. Centuries after this particular fire finally goes cold for the last time, long after the timber frame has decayed and the thatch has vanished entirely, the outline of this household's life will remain quietly preserved beneath the soil, post holes marking where walls once stood, a dark ring of ash where a hearth was carefully tended morning after morning, small fragments of pottery and stone scattered across what was once a working farmyard. It will take the patient, careful attention of archaeologists many generations later to begin recovering even a fraction of what this single day contained. And even then, so much will remain unknowable. The particular sound of this family's voices, the private thoughts carried quietly behind each face gathered around tonight's hearth, the small jokes and quiet tendernesses that leave no trace in soil or stone. And yet, something does remain, carried forward not through memory or writing, but through the landscape itself, fields still shaped by centuries of careful clearing, farming knowledge that would be refined and passed forward through countless later generations, and a simple, enduring truth about human life that connects this quiet Neolithic evening to every ordinary evening since, that survival, comfort, and meaning have always depended on patient, unglamorous labor, faithfully repeated, and on the quiet presence of family gathered at the close of another long day. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey into the world of an early farming family, consider subscribing to Bedtime Story Media for more calm, carefully researched historical documentaries designed to help you rest. Until next time, sleep well.